Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to Clean Technica's webinar on data centers and AI and renewable energy development. My name is Scott Cooney. I am your host for today. I am one of the founders and currently the Chief Operating Officer at Clean Technica, one of the business partners here alongside Zach. And I'll be leading this webinar this morning, which is sure to be very insightful. We have a lot of registrants for today, so I know it's a very exciting topic. Data centers, AI, renewable energy development, it's a crucial part of a growing landscape of renewable energy and the clean energy on the grid. I am here today joined by Ben Valley, Director of Energy Markets at Landgate. Welcome, Ben. Ben's going to have a quick presentation on the landscape, the rapidly evolving landscape that's going on in renewable energy development alongside data centers. And we'll be here to answer a lot of questions that the audience will have. We will do Q&A at the end. So just wanted to start off with some quick, interesting tidbits and facts. When you think about data centers, there's 3% of the world's electricity is actually used by data centers. It's agnostic geographically, so it creates kind of a very interesting situation for energy development. You really just need a connection to the rest of the internet. And otherwise, you're creating an opportunity to put renewable energy development that is in places that is independent of transmission lines and bottlenecks that come with permitting and that sort of thing. Still, obviously, a lot to consider there. And Ben is an expert in that field, and so I'm looking forward to learning a lot from him this morning. But data centers are everything from iClouds to websites, to cat videos, to Instagram Reels, to FaceTime. So if you think about data centers, the amount of storage that is needed is part of the equation. So a blog post uses a lot less storage than a podcast, which uses less storage than a video. So if you look at files stored on your computer or your hard drive or your Google Drive or any iCloud or anything like that, it'll show you how much storage space everything uses. And unfortunately, it creates a little bit of an incentive challenge. So many of the cloud storage companies make a lot of money by storing a lot of data and transmitting it back and forth. So it's the reason why, in my opinion, Apple created a camera for its phone that you can take pictures of your cat and blow it up to the size of a billboard. It's because it's a gigantic file and it will clog your iCloud. Nobody actually needs a billboard-sized photo of their cat. So AI, interestingly enough, is actually increasing this. So if you think about a Google search, which is yesterday's technology, some would say, it uses 0.3 watt hours to do a Google search. Now a ChatGPT search uses almost 10 times that much electricity. It's still a very minuscule 3 watt hours or 2.9 watt hours for every ChatGPT search. So it's super interesting how AI is now using more energy than a lot of our traditional technologies. So the big tech companies are obviously investing heavily in renewables for their data centers, mainly because it's cheaper, but also because they're pledging to reduce their footprints since their employees and customers are demanding it. So as a result, more than 2/3 of the corporate renewable market is actually made up of these tech companies powering their data centers. So it's driving massive renewable energy at some scale. It's also creating some efficiencies in storage and transmission and that sort of thing, obviously, because these companies are incentivized to reduce their energy use. But it's also creating competition for this renewable energy for other sources that could be using it. So if you think about a fleet of robo-taxis that could be using a lot of solar energy and bouncing in and out of a solar microgrid or on the grid, then the competition is now coming from data centers that are very energy hungry and wanting to be all renewables because that's where they want to be. So recently there was a project in direct air capture called Project Bison that was actually paused. It's from carbon capture, a company called Carbon Capture, and that's what they do is actually capture carbon from the atmosphere and lock it up somehow. And the project was canceled/paused, and at the very least will relocate. It was originally slated for going into Wyoming, where there's a lot of significant wind energy. And instead, it was outcompeted by data centers who are buying this renewable energy. So this is a very rapidly evolving landscape, and that's why I brought on Ben, the Director of Energy Markets at Landgate. So Landgate's a company that specializes in the logistics of renewable energy development, matching landholders with project developers, and giving each the tools that they need to make the process smooth and ensure the best possible outcome. So welcome, Ben. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate that. It's a very good intro. There's a lot going on in the space for sure. And I'll add to the piece for what we're bringing to the table from an insight perspective. Um, Langate actually sits at an interesting intersection because of providing infrastructure data to renewable energy developers and evaluation tools for citing their projects. We've recently started also providing similar data to data center developers. And so I've been going to data center conferences and have several data center clients now where we're learning very quickly different aspects of both industries and what they need and where they're going, really. So that's what we're going to do today. And I realized, given your intro, that it would be useful to set a little bit of context for the conversation because each type of data center relates differently to renewable energy. And so in preparation for this webinar, I actually went to our different clients and folks that I met in this space at these data center conferences, and I asked a couple questions to really understand from their perspective, their type of data center, how they relate to renewables. And then I went to some of our larger development groups, renewable energy development groups, and asked them how they're thinking about relating to data centers. So that's the full breadth of what we'll be bringing to the conversation today. And I'll kind of kick it off from there. Does that sound good to you, Scott?
That sounds great.
Awesome. So on the Landgate side here, really that context, just this is a few of the clients that we have to date on the renewable energy side, adding a few logos here for data centers as well. And diving right into the growth side that you mentioned, the market value right now is estimated at 99 billion. And so there's obviously all of those different use cases for data centers that there already were, aside from AI. But the real difference with AI is that it requires more GPU. And what that does is create a greater load on the power side for multiple reasons. One of them is that it just generates more heat. And so there's a need for cooling. And liquid cooling requires a lot of infrastructure and power. So it's kind of this exponential growth in the amount of power that's needed, as was mentioned several times. And so the location of these sites are pretty simple in the context that they need as cheap of power as possible, as reliable of power as possible, dependent on the type of data center. There's different constraints for reliability. And finally, they need the actual power. So the grid can only provide so much energy. And this is something that in my career, I've actually seen quite a lot of. I saw it as early as 10 years ago, a couple of projects that had competing load needs, a pot farm and a large multifamily development. And that was kind of my first view of seeing large projects stymied by competing need for large volumes of power. And so now with this data center space, it's just exploding. In that every data center conference, the main topic seems to be the need for power and finding it. So I'm going to break down three types of data centers so that as we go through these questions regarding the space and renewable energy, I can relate each type of data center to its associated renewable energy appetite. So the first one that's very popular is hyperscale data centers. I bring on this large image of a very big building just because in the name hyperscale, they are larger. They're not always this big. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're even bigger. I'm sure you've all seen different rendered images of what Google's doing, what Meta's doing. But this is the general size of a hyperscale data center. Now, the next type of data center is called an edge data center. What these are doing are really enabling the like a factory to have processing in place. It's the enablement of even the robo-taxis that you were talking about. There needs to be very fast processing in a locational perspective. But the actual data center itself does not need to be a large building. In fact, it can't be because it needs to be geographically spread out because proximity is part of the issue for an edge data center. And then finally, for an AI data center, it's kind of in the middle where it's really application dependent, it's customer dependent in its size, but it goes back to that high GPU, high energy need. And so they're really following where they can find load. And oftentimes they're also kind of going to the same locations. A lot of data center developers were telling me that essentially a lot of other types of data centers follow hyperscalers because of the infrastructure that the hyperscaler brings. So I just wanted to give that context because in talking to each one of these, and we'll break it down simplistically into three: hyperscalers, edge data centers, and AI data centers. And each one of them have given me different answers as to how they relate to renewable energy. So there's obviously a few details that I go into on these slides on each type of hyperscale data center. I'm going to do that really quickly and then go from there. So the biggest one on the hyperscale data center is just that it does use the most volume of power. So that's the main point to remember for this conversation. On the edge data center, it does use a fair amount of power, up to 50 megawatts, but interestingly, edge data centers are taking large advantage of the vacancy of buildings due to COVID. So a lot of them are finding vacant locations and then building out there. And so in that case, renewable energy is kind of an afterthought. That any data center company wants to be competitive in bringing customers. So they certainly like renewable energy in the fact that it can reduce the cost of energy for their customers that are using the data center. And because of the obvious benefits of ESG and all of that. But ultimately, they put that onto their own clients, not the edge data centers themselves. And then finally, on AI data centers, again, it's kind of in the middle and case dependent, but ultimately, because there's a large need for power, they are following the infrastructure load across the United States. So I'll pause there and put it back to you, Scott, for your questions.
Thanks. That's great. It's a good overview of the three types, and that's it's insightful. I will say that we are welcoming Q&A more towards the end. If you do have a very pertinent question, you can go ahead and pop it into the Q&A box on your Zoom. But yeah, I mean, I think if you can give a now that you've given the three primary types of data centers, what is the real integration of renewable energy with these types of data centers and the primary, I don't know, benefits and challenges to this intersection?
Yeah, so I'll make this pretty fun and actually go into a project that
Great.
I've identified. In that respect, I have to give you kind of a tour of what's happening here on the Landgate side. And so what you're seeing on the screen is obviously an aerial map. And I went to a location where there's a couple of planned data centers. This is in Wyoming, and there's Microsoft that's building a plant called Bison Business Park. Nearby, there's also Lunavi that's building a data center, and then Meta. So you can kind of see already what we're talking about of everybody kind of going to the same place for a variety of reasons. In the context of your question for what they're looking for, really the first thing that they're worried about before anything else is whether or not there is what's called offtake capacity. In the context of offtake capacity, we think of it in megawatts. And so seeing where there is offtake capacity in the area is that really the first constraint that they're looking at. And then when it comes to renewable energy, there's two ways that they relate to it. Number one, virtual PPA. Number two, PPA. And then finally, they can do on-site behind the meter generation. There's different benefits to all of those different routes. If they have on-site generation, it's something that then they kind of fold into their reliability. But as we all know, renewable energy is based on the sun and clouds and so on. And so as far as reliability is concerned, they also need to have batteries and natural gas to actually be able to fully fill out that reliability aspect. But again, coming back to the screen, something that we're seeing just from the Landgate Insight side is a project that's in process here. So Hanwha has a project that is slated for operational date at 2027. And that's something that we've identified at the county clerk recorder level and then established the boundaries of this project. And so you can see that it's fairly close to this data center. And so it's going to be probably one of the first conversations for a PPA for offtake for this data center. And for those of you that aren't in the industry, I'll kind of simplify what that means. And it is that the energy that the data center consumes is then locked in at a certain price with the renewable energy provider. And so that does something from a cost perspective. If they were tied into the grid, they would be beholden to the rising cost of electricity from the grid. So they're essentially hedging their bets against the rising cost of electricity. And then there's the ESG benefits. And so there's varying degrees that the data center companies are looking for in terms of how reliably they're offsetting their carbon footprint. So a virtual PPA is one step, but it's kind of soft because of the fact that it's virtual. And so when you actually have on-site generation, it's more credible in a sense that they're actually reducing their carbon footprint. And the main thing that a data center is looking for when they're siting in this location is that they're going to look for several renewable energy developers to contract with so that they can get the best PPA price, right? It's supply and demand like any other industry where they ultimately want to find the best offer for that renewable energy. And so the way that data center developers are using our platform today is they go in and look at other projects that are established as site controlled projects or queued projects, and then they reach out to those developers to solicit more bids essentially for the virtual PPA for the offtake. So any questions from that, Scott?
So the virtual, yeah, that's great, Ben. Thank you. So the virtual PPA, I mean, it can kind of come from anywhere. It doesn't have to necessarily be something that's local and
Correct.
accessible in any direct way through the data center.
Yep,
And
that's
then
right.
is this the type of data that you could provide to the company using the energy for these virtual and these PPAs? Can you give them data that is like how renewable, how reliable those renewables are, how much of a percentage is coming from solar, from batteries, from some, peaker natural gas sort of option? Is that the type of data that you guys provide to those developers and to the data centers themselves?
Yep, that's right. So in any given location, there's a whole list of different generators, right? You can even see here from a plant perspective, we have batteries, biomass, coal, geothermal, hydroelectric. And so on any given power line, there's a percentage of all of these different energy types. And there's differences in the reliability based on the generation and proximity to that data center. But that doesn't relate to the virtual PPA. That's just a straight reliability measure. And from that reliability perspective, I have a data set pulled up here, which is our natural gas pipelines. And so this teal line right here is natural gas, making it so that these data centers are very likely going to tie in essentially a peaker plant. And again, simplistically, there's a couple of ways that you can create reliability, whether it's batteries and solar and natural gas. Or some companies are actually going with electrolysis as a route. If you have a solar project that is overbuilt in the context of the power that it provides, so that there's enough kilowatt hours to offset their electricity. You could, with the excess generation, use electrolyzers to then have essentially hydrogen and then ammonia as an output. And that's a different type of project that we've recently seen a partner do in conjunction with a data center, where there's actually the output of that hydrogen and ammonia creation goes to a nearby fertilizer plant. But meanwhile, the output of the heat of the data center cooling itself creates an efficiency in that electrolysis process. So that is another unique way that I've seen renewable energy in its conjunction with data centers happening, which is actually quite fascinating because it's literally all of them, or not all of them, but a lot: solar, hydrogen, data centers, right?
That's fascinating. So the literal heat coming off of these servers, which is a big part of energy use in a data center. The literal heat is used to help catalyze the electrolysis process to create green hydrogen from excess solar during the day.
Correct.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that requires a lot of factors. Like if there's developers on the call, they'll laugh at the fact that that requires so many things to be in place in one area. But that's something that they found was there was enough water. They had to have the water rights for it.
Mm.
And there was an ammonia pipeline nearby. and a fertilizer plant and the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure in place to be working with large volumes of electricity from an injection standpoint and from an offtake standpoint for the data center developer.
That's incredible. So you're able to help facilitate that whole process for these developers to figure out whether all these pieces are in place.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
incredible. Okay.
Yeah, and that's we kind of dove into it quickly in the context of what you see here. All the pieces are really here. So in red, there's the transmission line and who owns it, the voltage, and then the substations are in yellow here. Your data center is, if it's planned, it's this yellow circle. And then I actually have our buildable acreage outline set up here, just showing that this location right here has a lot of buildable acreage. That's why Hanwha has selected this location for their PV site.
Very cool. So you're able to give that kind of data to the developers and give them a big head start with regard to where to start looking so they don't have to sift through a million options. They can sift through a handful of very qualified options.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
And,
Makes a lot of
and
sense.
And that's something that's done in two ways, really. For the sophisticated developer on the call, oftentimes there's unique data sets that only Landgate has created. And so they'll feed those into their own ArcGIS environments. And then those that are coming from Europe or just starting out, or really want something that's a little bit easier to use than ArcGIS, they'll actually use this parcel search tool. And I'll break down really quickly the difference between a data center's perspective and a renewable energy developer's perspective. So they'll search for a parcel that is of appropriate size in proximity to available transfer capacity. That's the main searches that they're running. They may add in buildable acreage and zoning and things like that, but ultimately the race is now for available transfer capacity. And then the exact same search is actually utilized for a data center developer in that they're searching for a volume of offtake capacity, both of which can be done within Landgate.
It's very cool. Right on. So how do these renewable sources really best align with the operational needs of these data centers?
Yeah, so there's I'll answer that from the perspective of both sides. So a data center developer, I already mentioned it, they're basically looking for the best PPA price. There are some ways that the developers are coming to the table with reliability solutions. And that's something that I have heard from every type of data center developer that they're interested in what a developer has to offer there. The other thing that they said that they're interested in is actually their site control position. So developers, if you talk to any large developer, they'll brag about the amount of acreage that they have and amount of parcels that they have under what's called site control. And that's something that is interesting to large data center developers is those relationships because ultimately, as you all know, in order to contract with a private party, whether it's an individual landowner or a business, you have to be able to get in contact with them and have a relationship with them or have agreements in place. And so data center developers are leveraging that. And in the context of our platform, because we go down very, very deep into the weeds in the county clerk reporter and planning meetings, we identify more developers so that data center developers can have more conversations and essentially find the best fit for them. And you could think about it the opposite way as well. A data center, or excuse me, a renewable energy developer coming into our platform can then identify more data centers that we've identified in certain areas to have more conversations.
So you're kind of matchmaking as well.
Exactly. A
Yeah,
lot of matchmaking. Yeah.
very cool. Right on. So these, how does, obviously a lot of data centers, the big tech companies are talking a lot, their ESG goals are very clear and they're trying to get to 100% renewables and that sort of thing. So in what ways are you guys really kind of supporting those objectives for those big companies?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really what I just said more than anything. It's getting them in contact with more
With the renewable
developers,
developers?
um, and having developers actually find creative solutions. There was a data center developer that gave me a pretty poignant example in that they were talking to a natural gas company and I mean, there's many solutions out there, but with some of those solutions, they require 1 month of downtime every 2 years to essentially do maintenance on that natural gas peaker plant. And so you can see how that's a big issue. You want to be able to log in your Gmail every day instead of as an obtuse example, you don't want to not use your email for 1 month, right?
Right.
And so that's really the thing that's very fascinating about this time for both parties is finding what the most robust solutions are that'll last the longest and that, of course, are the least expensive.
Sounds good. Um, so at this stage, what are you seeing in terms of these the trends, the future trends of what's happening, where this is all going? Um, we talked about a lot of the current technology. It's, some peaker plants and the hydrogen and the ammonia and that sort of thing. If you have your crystal ball, like what are you looking at with regard to renewables, data centers, and what's Landgate doing to kind of prepare for this and address these trends?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest thing that Landgate is doing is just providing more data for these companies to really be able to dive in to the best location that they can possibly have. And so I'm going to go into a couple of those data sets that are um, hard to get and that we've identified. But I'll answer it a different way first, in that I had an interesting conversation with a larger data center developer that said that all of this AI, again, that GPU issue, the high power need, is something that they're all thinking about now. But interestingly, said that within 5 years, he wondered if there is going to be a point where the LLM models actually no longer need to run, right? So when you're training an LLM model, there was a point where that training is complete and then it can be used, and then there is a large reduction in the power use. And so that's something that surprised me, where this large data center developer saying, "Hey, there's going to be this huge need for power, and they're going to build all this infrastructure around it, and all of a sudden they won't use a lot of the power." And that was surprising to me. But then I talked to a different data center developer that said that is, he's unsure of that claim, in that he said that would be like saying that within 5 years we would have answered all the questions that we needed with AI. And so obviously that's also not the case. We'll probably create more problems for ourselves that we'll need more LLM models to solve. But ultimately, this is all about where are you siting these data centers to be able to take advantage of natural resources like solar, like wind, to be able to offset that power consumption. um, as much as possible.
Makes sense. So do you have some advice then for renewable energy developers who are considering working with data centers? I know we had quite a few EPCs sign up for this, so I know this question is top of mind, and we do have a bunch of questions from participants that we can roll into here in a moment. But yeah, just wanted to start off with that. Like, what advice do you give the renewable energy developers considering projects in this space?
Yeah, so I think I have that question almost every day come up with whether it's a client or somebody new that I'm talking to. And the biggest thing really is to be able to quickly get in contact with data center developers and to show them where you have projects and to show them really as much data as possible. I'm obviously as biased as they come because I provide data, but there's a number of ways that you can get these different data sources. We bring them all into one place, but really there's the top three items are offtake capacity and understanding that side of the equation. And then one that I haven't talked about yet is actually water. So I'll kind of turn off all of these other data sets so that we can look at just water. And so this is a representation of water lines in Houston, the city of Houston, their water lines. And so in again on the AI side, because of the need for cooling, a lot of those data center developers are looking for the location of water lines and how much water they would have access to. And so if I'm a developer or an EPC, really what I'm going to be doing is trying to understand each one of the locations that I'm building a project and how it relates to a data center. So in this case, I could identify, okay, there is these water lines. The next one that we can overlay on top of that is fiber, long haul fiber and metro fiber, and who owns that fiber. Obviously, bringing in the actual data centers themselves for that conversation. And then next coming to the offtake capacity here. And so if I go into offtake capacity just as a quick example, and what this conversation means for a data center developer, they're really looking at the number of megawatts continuous that they can draw. And Landgate is essentially using a small army of engineers to be able to make these calculations on over 30,000 POIs and then tell you the exact transfer limitation based on a power flow model. And so to roll that back up to your question, really coming to the table for a conversation with a data center with all of the information in hand that demonstrates the viability of a project is going to afford the best conversation. And then finally, the one that I'd add is any information about the evolving battery technologies in this space for integration with reliability would be the key factors that I'd bring to a data center conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. Great. I want to open this up to some audience questions. I know we have quite a few who are queued up here.
Cool.
I guess I'm curious, Ben, just kind of off the top of your head, if you had to give a kind of estimates of what we're looking at in terms of, the three types of offtake capacities you talk about, the virtual PPAs, the regular PPAs, and then behind the meter stuff. What percentages are we looking at roughly for what's going on currently, and where do you see those percentages kind of heading? I'm very curious with regard to the behind the meter stuff. Are there data centers out there, maybe the edge data centers, are they able to provide all the power that they need using behind the meter generation and storage? Also curious is in terms of like the percentages of batteries versus peaker plants. So many questions for you, but take whichever one you like and roll with it.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's pretty simple. I used to be an EPC developer, so I would sell off-grid systems, solar and batteries. That was my background before Landgate. And really, it comes down to a question of cost per reliability. And finally, bringing in like the way that they look at it when they're going through those discussions are um, their ESG goals and how that compares to their hurdle rate and the current technology and the reliability therein. And so you kind of have to answer the question for each different type of data center. For an edge data center, because it's a smaller load, you could conceivably offset the electricity that it uses on site if you have a large enough rooftop. It'd have to be
Hmm.
a pretty wide building for that to be the case. But ultimately, what that is going to do is be some greenwashing in that you have a pretty picture of a data center with a rooftop solar project on it. But mostly they're going to be looking at cost. And it's going to be an interesting conversation between the data center developer, the person who creates it, the data center operator, the person who is operating within that, and then finally the renewable energy contractor, because the data center developer, their perspective is that they would love to have renewable energy, but they can't necessarily pay for it because their operators sometimes just get virtual PPAs. Now, the reason why they may want to find that collaboration in between the two is that they know that if they provide their client with the lowest cost of electricity because of that on-site behind the meter generation, that they'll likely stay. But depending on the type of operator, if it's cloud storage, for instance, that the actual geographic location of the data processing doesn't matter. That data center edge developer could have somebody who's paying them for their site and then just leave to a lower cost location.
Interesting. All right, well, thanks for that. All right, good question from the audience. With regard to like offtake of waste heat, are there other good co-location industrial partners you're able to bring into this besides hydrogen, that can use that waste heat?
Wow, that is a really good question. I'm sure that there is, but I've never heard of that in my conversations yet. Um, but that's a really good question. I do know it's I'm kind of sidestepping it, but it's really all I got, and that is that there's an interest in locating a facility near a wastewater treatment plant. And that's just because yeah, for those of you that haven't thought about it deeply, when you electrolyze water, it's gone, right? The water is no longer in the ecosystem. And so both for hydrogen plants and for data centers, if they're using actual water, they both are interested in wastewater treatment plants because as human beings, we're a little bit less interested in the water that's coming out of the back end of our wastewater.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Um, all right. Another question. Are there trends around data center developers preferring sourcing through the grid or direct from a microgrid? Obviously, some combination of all.
Um,
Obviously, with regard to reliability on site versus what they can pull from the grid, there's obviously a lot of considerations, but do you see trends from data center developers with regard to their preferences?
Yes, but I mean, I think that it's the snapshot that I have, it's just hard to say where the whole industry is going. I have talked to a fair amount of data center developers that are more interested in natural gas because of the reliability of providing peak power quickly. and the cost compared to batteries. But really, I think that it comes down to those use cases that any of you as EPCs or developers have, and having a clear picture of the reliability, the cost for that reliability, and the different synergies that you can offer a data center developer. I want to say one other thing from your last question that I thought of, and something that has been on my mind that I don't know the answer to, but I would ask the person who asked that question in the audience is fracking uses a lot of water. And they end up with a large amount of wastewater that they don't know what to do with. Sometimes they re-inject it. And that's something that's been on my mind, where if a data center is looking at trying to not use potable water, then going to that water that has some of those chemicals, the benzenes and odd things that you don't want to put back into the ecosystem, I think that that would be a really cool collaboration. And there may also be industrial cases for that question, where perhaps there's other industrial processes that damage water, and then they have to deal with that water, and perhaps there would be a way for a data center to then take that and use it.
Interesting use of non-potable water for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question, typical megawatt requirements for AI versus hyperscaler versus edge data centers.
Yeah, so I mean, this is tough because I ask that question to a lot of data center developers, and I almost don't believe them. But I'll answer what I was given. I've heard numbers like 3 gigawatts for hyperscalers. Yeah, I wonder if that's not bragawatts, but it's possible. But certainly 500 megawatts plus. And then on I'll just kind of further that and say on the edge side, I've heard anything from 5 to 50. I'm sure depending on the complexity and number of edge projects that would depend. But that's your number there. And then on the AI side, I've heard the full range. So there's been folks who have told me that they need 400 megawatts continuous power and a couple hundred acres at a time. And then I've heard smaller numbers as well.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
All right, let's see, scrolling through some more questions. Thanks everybody for these questions. Yeah, interesting question about nuclear. So obviously there's been some talk recently, 3 Mile Island reopening in particular has been in the news, specifically as a project to, power data centers. So what do you see with regard to this trend, and how is Landgate interacting with nuclear, if at all?
Yeah, so we actually have a couple nuclear clients. And they actually use our tool very similar to a developer, in that it's ultimately an industrial application, so all of the same rules apply and more, right? So they'll use Landgate as a screening tool to identify infrastructure locations and available transfer capacity, just like a renewable energy developer. Ultimately, the ATC limitation is any generator, right? And the grid is ultimately just made up of a bunch of lines and substations. So it's like the thermal load, the heat that is generated through producing electricity on those lines. It doesn't matter if you're one solar panel or nuclear plant, the volume of power that you can input into the grid is dependent on that infrastructure and the power flow models that connect the infrastructure. And so those calculations that we provide are useful for them. And then I believe they also, it's been a while since I talked to those guys. I believe that they also are beholden to NERC. So the nuclear regulations that are above and beyond any regulations for the industrial uses of solar, wind, or natural gas. And a fun fact about that I learned in the process is that a nuclear plant has to be able to withstand a airplane. I think it was like a 787 size airplane running into it and that not damaging the system. So obviously that's why it takes longer to get that through a process. But I think that it's an important measure, honestly. I used to be a little bit wary of nuclear, but for obvious reasons. But the reliability in that industry has really evolved from what I've seen, and they have smaller and smaller nuclear plants that they can deploy that I think are very interesting for balancing the grid.
So it's going to be a fascinating and evolving kind of space. So, and I'm really curious if if those regulations around the 787 existed when 3 Mile Island was created. I don't know. And whether that's kind of lubricating the process of reopening it because it might be grandfathered into some things that maybe the newer plants might have to comply a little bit more with. Hard to say. Certainly something I could try to look up and maybe write an article for Clean Technica about later on today. That'd be kind of interesting. Okay, let's see. Good question here. Um, do you foresee issues around interconnection queues, permitting, and other issues slowing data center build out growth?
Yes. So Landgate has a fascinating technology that actually goes and takes city meetings and county meetings. And there's over 20,000 cities and counties in across the United States that publish their meetings in a video. Why am I talking about this? We transcribe or we have transcriptions of all of those meetings as soon as they're published and can set up notifications for words. And so we set up a notification just a few months ago when we really started working and actually having data center clients and set up a flag for data center moratorium. And I've seen a handful of them across all of the United States in them coming up. You may have heard about it as noise issues, but there's other issues that inhabitants wonder about in the context of is this all going to be built out and then left so that then there's this big commercial desert and all these questions that I've seen by reading these hearings that were flagged. And so that is something that is already an issue and that Landgate will be paying attention to. We don't have this yet, but right now our software team is currently integrating that data set into the tool so that as these siting exercises are happening within Landgate, you can also turn on a layer that shows whether or not there is a data center moratorium or even just the start of a conversation. Sometimes somebody will come to a planning meeting and say, hey, I propose that we establish a 1 year moratorium so that we can create regulations for these data center developers so that they don't just build up their project and all of a sudden everybody's like, what's going on with this aspect of the way that you built it. So that's something that we'll certainly see and within the platform.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you very much. This has been super informative today. I really appreciate it. If you have any closing remarks, I'd be happy to hear them. Otherwise, thank you for joining us and for sharing all this incredible information. This is very educational, I know, for me and for a lot of other people. There's a ton of questions we didn't get to, and sorry if I didn't get to your question. We just kind of are running out of time. But obviously a great topic. We will be recording this. We have recorded this webinar and it will be on Clean Technica's YouTube channel. You can find that at youtube.com/cleantechnica. Subscribe there if you haven't already, please. And please share the webinar with anybody that you think might be interested in this space. Ben, any closing remarks that you'd like to make with regard to everything we've discussed?
Yeah, just one closing remark for the developers, whether it's a data center developer or renewable developer that hasn't heard of Landgate. I just wanted to mention that one aspect that you mentioned all the way in the beginning, but that I didn't present on is this marketplace. So if you have any questions, if you're out there looking for land around infrastructure, I would say certainly reach out to me or one of my team members, and we'll help you to understand all the ways that we can help, whether it's siting or connecting you with landowners.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ben. Really appreciate you this morning. And yeah, this was super educational. So really appreciate you helping us understand the whole ecosystem.
You bet.
All right. Take care, everyone.